You're watching the evening news when a breaking story interrupts regular programming about a woman who could completely change the direction of one of the most controversial cases in recent memory. The woman's name is Celeste Morgan, and her decision to come forward represents a seismic shift in the investigation into David Chen's alleged kidnapping of Celeste Rivas. For months, investigators had struggled to build a timeline that definitively placed David at the scene when Celeste Rivas disappeared. His defense had maintained he couldn't have been involved because he was with someone else during the critical time period. That someone else was Celeste Morgan, and she had just walked into the district attorney's office with a story that shattered David's alibi completely. Celeste Morgan sat across from prosecutors with her attorney beside her, visibly shaking as she began to recount what she described as months of manipulation and psychological pressure from David. She explained that she had known David for several years through mutual friends and had trusted him when he asked for what seemed like a simple favor. He needed someone to vouch for his whereabouts on a specific evening, claiming he was dealing with a personal situation he didn't want anyone to know about. She agreed to say they had been together that night, never imagining the request was connected to something as serious as a kidnapping. The timeline Celeste Morgan provided to investigators painted a disturbing picture of calculated deception. David had approached her weeks before Celeste Rivas disappeared, planting the seeds for the alibi he would eventually need. He had been building their friendship more intensively during that period, creating more frequent contact and shared experiences that would make it believable they had spent an evening together. The premeditation suggested someone who had been planning something terrible and was carefully constructing cover stories well in advance. Detective Sarah Mitchell, leading the investigation into Celeste Rivas's disappearance, explained during a press conference that Celeste Morgan's testimony represented a critical break in the case. The alibi David had relied on was now revealed as fabricated, leaving a significant gap in his accounting of his whereabouts during the time when Celeste Rivas was last seen. Without the alibi, physical evidence and witness statements that had seemed inconclusive now took on much greater significance in establishing David's involvement. Celeste Morgan described the moment she realized the true purpose of the favor David had asked. She had seen news coverage of Celeste Rivas's disappearance and the subsequent investigation into David's possible involvement. When she heard the date in question, her blood ran cold as she recognized it as the same evening David had asked her to provide cover for. She immediately understood she had been manipulated into providing a false alibi for someone potentially involved in a serious crime. The psychological burden of that realization had been crushing. Celeste Morgan explained through tears that she had spent weeks agonizing over whether to come forward. She feared legal consequences for having lied to investigators initially when asked about David's whereabouts. She worried about retaliation from David or people loyal to him. Most painfully, she struggled with guilt about whether her lie had allowed someone dangerous to remain free when he should have been in custody. The weight of potentially being complicit, even unknowingly, in a terrible crime had finally driven her to contact authorities. Prosecutors assured Celeste Morgan she would receive immunity from prosecution for her initial false statements in exchange for her full cooperation and truthful testimony. They recognized she had been manipulated by someone with malicious intent, and that her decision to come forward, despite the personal risks and consequences, demonstrated genuine remorse and desire to see justice served. Her testimony would become central to the case against David, transforming what had been a circumstantial case into something much more concrete. Now people are wondering, when someone you trusted manipulates you into providing cover for terrible acts, how do you live with the knowledge of what your trust enabled? Celeste Morgan's detailed account of her interactions with David revealed a pattern of manipulation that extended far beyond the single false alibi. As prosecutors questioned her extensively, a picture emerged of someone who had been systematically grooming her to serve as his cover without her realizing the true purpose of their relationship. The friendship between Celeste Morgan and David had intensified noticeably in the months before Celeste Rivas disappeared. David had been reaching out more frequently, suggesting casual meetups and social activities that created a documented pattern of them spending time together. Phone records and social media posts showed regular interaction that would make it believable they had been together on the evening in question. Prosecutors realized this documentation had been deliberately created by David to support the alibi he knew he would eventually need. Celeste Morgan described how David had carefully cultivated her trust and sympathy. He had shared what he claimed were personal struggles and family problems, positioning himself as someone going through difficult times, who needed support from friends. The vulnerability he displayed had been calculated to make Celeste feel protective of him and willing to help when he asked for favors. Looking back, she recognized that every confidence he shared had been designed to manipulate her emotions and ensure her cooperation. The specific request for the alibi had been made with sophisticated psychological manipulation. David hadn't simply asked Celeste to lie for him. Instead, he had presented the situation as a personal crisis where he needed discretion to protect someone else from embarrassment or harm. He claimed he had been helping a friend deal with a sensitive situation and couldn't reveal details because it would violate that person's privacy. The explanation had seemed reasonable and even noble, appealing to Celeste's desire to help someone in need. When investigators initially questioned Celeste Morgan about David's whereabouts on the evening Celeste Rivas disappeared, she had provided the alibi without hesitation because she believed it was true. David had been so convincing in his request that she genuinely thought she was protecting him from unfair suspicion while he dealt with a legitimate personal matter. It wasn't until later, when the investigation focused more intensely on David and the timeline became clearer, that she began to question whether she had been deceived. The moment of realization had come when Celeste Morgan reviewed her own calendar and phone records more carefully. She noticed that David had actually contacted her after the time they were supposedly together, asking her to remember they had spent that evening watching movies at her apartment. The timing of his message made it clear he was establishing an alibi after the fact rather than simply confirming plans they had actually made. That discrepancy forced her to confront the possibility that everything he had told her was a lie. Celeste Morgan's decision to come forward had been complicated by fear of the consequences she would face for initially lying to investigators. Her attorney had to assure her repeatedly that immunity agreements would protect her from prosecution before she felt safe enough to reveal the truth. The legal protection was crucial because without it, her admission would have exposed her to charges of obstruction of justice or accessory after the fact, potentially resulting in serious criminal penalties. The psychological impact on Celeste Morgan of discovering she had been used in this way was severe. She described feeling violated by someone she had considered a friend, betrayed in a way that made her question her judgment about people and relationships. The knowledge that her lie had potentially delayed justice for Celeste Rivas and her family created guilt that therapy was helping her process but that would likely affect her for years to come. When someone manipulates your kindness and trust to commit terrible acts, how do you ever trust your instincts about people again? The collapse of David's alibi triggered an immediate shift in the investigation's intensity and focus. Detectives who had been frustrated by the lack of definitive evidence suddenly found that witness statements and physical evidence that seemed inconclusive now formed a coherent narrative of guilt when viewed without the assumption that David had an alibi for the critical time period. Detective Sarah Mitchell assembled her team to reconstruct the timeline of events surrounding Celeste Rivas' disappearance with the new understanding that David's whereabouts during those hours were unaccounted for. Surveillance footage that had been dismissed because it didn't match with his supposed alibi was re-examined and found to show someone matching David's description near the location where Celeste Rivas was last seen. The footage wasn't conclusive enough to identify him definitively, but combined with other evidence, it became significantly more meaningful. Cell phone records showed David's phone had been in the general vicinity of where Celeste Rivas disappeared, contradicting his previous claims about his location. His defense had explained this away by suggesting his phone could have been in the area while he was actually at Celeste Morgan's apartment. But now that the alibi was proven false, the phone records became damning evidence of his presence near the crime scene. Technical analysis showed the phone had been moving along routes consistent with someone following or searching for a specific person. Witnesses who had reported seeing someone they thought might be David near Celeste Rivas before her disappearance were re-interviewed with renewed attention to their statements. Several witnesses became more confident in their identifications when shown photos, and when the timeline was reconstructed without the alibi creating confusion. One witness who had been uncertain before now stated clearly that he recognized David as the person he had seen speaking with Celeste Rivas outside a convenience store shortly before she vanished. Physical evidence from David's vehicle, which had been collected during the investigation but hadn't proven conclusive, was subjected to more detailed forensic analysis. Trace evidence that hadn't been prioritized when he had an alibi was now examined more thoroughly. Forensic experts found fiber evidence consistent with clothing Celeste Rivas had been wearing, and soil samples matching the area where her belongings were eventually discovered. The evidence had been there all along, but the alibi had created doubt about its significance. The revelation that David had premeditated establishing a false alibi fundamentally changed how investigators viewed all evidence in the case. His actions demonstrated consciousness of guilt and advanced planning that indicated he knew he would need cover for his activities. Prosecutors explained that creating a fake alibi before committing a crime was itself powerful evidence of criminal intent and guilt. Innocent people don't manufacture cover stories for time periods when they're planning to do nothing wrong. Celeste Morgan's willingness to testify about David's manipulation provided prosecutors with direct evidence of his deceptive character and willingness to involve innocent people in his criminal schemes. Her testimony would humanize the case and show jurors how someone could be deceived by David's calculated manipulation. The emotional impact of her betrayal would make his actions feel more personal and disturbing to people following the case. Social media posts and communications between David and Celeste Morgan were analyzed for additional evidence of his manipulation and the timeline of his alibi construction. Digital forensics experts found deleted messages that showed David had been more explicit about needing her to provide cover than she had initially remembered. The deleted communications suggested David had been nervous about electronic evidence and had tried to minimize the digital trail of his alibi planning. The case against David was now strong enough that prosecutors felt confident moving forward with formal charges. The combination of Celeste Morgan's testimony, Physical evidence, cell phone records, and witness statements created what they believed was a compelling case that would demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that David was responsible for Celeste Rivas's kidnapping and whatever harm had befallen her. When someone goes to the lengths of creating elaborate false alibis before committing crimes, what does that reveal about their awareness of their own guilt? The formal charges against David were announced during a press conference that drew intense media attention and brought renewed focus to Celeste Rivas's case. Prosecutors detailed multiple counts including kidnapping, assault, and conspiracy charges related to manipulating Celeste Morgan into providing false statements. The breadth of charges reflected the seriousness of the allegations and the strength of evidence prosecutors believed they had assembled. David's defense team, which had been aggressively maintaining his innocence and pointing to the alibi as proof he couldn't have been involved, found themselves in a difficult position after Celeste Morgan's revelation. Lead defense attorney Marcus Wellington held his own press conference attempting to discredit her testimony by suggesting she had been pressured by prosecutors or was seeking attention through involvement in a high-profile case. His argument seemed desperate to observers familiar with the case. The defense team's strategy shifted to questioning why Celeste Morgan had waited so long to come forward if her story was true. They suggested that her delayed disclosure indicated her account wasn't reliable, and that she might have been influenced by media coverage or outside pressure to change her story. Wellington argued that the original alibi statement she provided was contemporaneous and therefore more reliable than her later recantation made months after the investigation began. Prosecutors countered by presenting evidence of David's pattern of manipulation, not just with Celeste Morgan, but with other people in his life. Investigators had identified additional individuals who described experiences where David had asked them to provide cover stories, or had manipulated situations to create false impressions about his activities. The pattern demonstrated that using people to establish alibis and cover his tracks was characteristic behavior rather than an isolated incident. Forensic psychologists consulted by the prosecution provided analysis of the manipulation tactics David had employed with Celeste Morgan. They explained how perpetrators often groom potential alibi witnesses through seemingly innocent friendship building and trust development. The psychological pressure on someone who has been manipulated into lying becomes intense once they realize what they've done, often requiring time to work through fear and guilt before they can come forward with the truth. The revelation of the false alibi created additional legal exposure for David beyond the kidnapping charges. Prosecutors filed separate charges related to obstruction of justice and witness tampering for his actions in manipulating Celeste Morgan to provide false statements to investigators. These charges demonstrated that even if the kidnapping case somehow failed, David would still face serious consequences for interfering with the investigation through his deceptive actions. Public opinion shifted dramatically following Celeste Morgan's testimony. Social media discussions that had been divided about David's guilt became overwhelmingly convinced of his responsibility for Celeste Rivas's disappearance. The calculated nature of creating a false alibi before committing a crime struck people as particularly damning evidence of guilty consciousness. True crime communities analyzed every detail of how David had manipulated Celeste Morgan, creating content examining the psychology of such manipulation. Celeste Rivas's family, who had been waiting months for progress in the investigation into their daughter's disappearance, expressed cautious hope that Celeste Morgan's testimony would finally bring justice. They issued a statement thanking Celeste Morgan for her courage in coming forward, despite the personal costs and legal risks. The statement acknowledged the difficult position she had been in, and emphasized that they viewed her as another victim of David's manipulation rather than as complicit in his crimes. The media coverage of the case intensified with the revelation of the false alibi and the collapse of David's defense. News outlets provided extensive analysis of how the case had transformed from one where David claimed innocence backed by an alibi to one where he was revealed as a calculated manipulator who had planned his crimes carefully enough to establish cover stories in advance. When someone's alibi is proven false, especially when they created it deliberately before committing their crime, how much does that single fact change the entire perception of guilt? The trial preparation revealed even more disturbing details about David's relationship with both Celeste's and the calculated nature of his actions. As prosecutors built their case, they discovered that David had been monitoring both women's social media and daily routines for an extended period before Celeste Rivas's disappearance, suggesting his crimes had been planned with significant premeditation. Digital forensics examination of David's devices uncovered extensive research into how kidnapping investigations were conducted, what evidence was typically used to establish suspects' presence at crime scenes, and how alibis were evaluated by law enforcement. The search history painted a picture of someone who had studied criminal investigation procedures specifically to plan how to evade detection. His knowledge had informed his decision to establish an alibi witness before committing his crimes. Evidence emerged that David had targeted Celeste Rivas specifically, rather than randomly, though the exact motive remained unclear. Investigators found that he had been present at several locations where she regularly spent time in the weeks before her disappearance. He appeared to have been studying her routines and patterns, identifying when she was most vulnerable to being approached or followed without witnesses present. The stalking behavior demonstrated extended planning and preparation. Celeste Morgan's testimony revealed additional concerning details about David's behavior in the days immediately following Celeste Rivas's disappearance. He had contacted Celeste Morgan multiple times to reinforce the alibi story, reminding her of details about their supposed evening together, and coaching her on what to say if anyone asked questions. The coaching suggested he was worried the alibi might be tested, and wanted to ensure she would provide consistent statements under questioning. Most chillingly, David had made comments to Celeste Morgan that took on sinister new meaning in light of what was now known. He had mentioned feeling like he was being watched, and that law enforcement was targeting him unfairly. At the time, Celeste Morgan had interpreted these statements as paranoia or anxiety, but looking back, she realized he had been testing her loyalty and commitment to maintaining the false alibi. His statements had been designed to reinforce her sympathy and willingness to protect him. The prosecution's case included expert testimony about the psychology of perpetrators who involve others in their crimes through manipulation rather than explicit recruitment. Psychologists explained that sophisticated offenders often prefer to have accomplices who don't fully understand what they're participating in, because such individuals make more convincing witnesses if questioned. Celeste Morgan's genuine belief in the alibi she provided had made her a more effective cover for David than an aware accomplice would have been. Physical evidence linking David to Celeste Rivas continued to accumulate as forensic examination became more thorough. DNA evidence found in his vehicle was matched definitively to Celeste Rivas, establishing beyond doubt that she had been in his car at some point. The defense's argument that this could have been transfer evidence from innocent contact was weakened significantly by the quantity and location of the genetic material found. The evidence suggested she had been in his vehicle against her will. Witness testimony placed David's vehicle near the area where Celeste Rivas's personal belongings were eventually discovered, contradicting his claims that he had never been in that location. Multiple witnesses provided independent statements about seeing a vehicle matching his car's description in the remote area during the time period when evidence suggested her belongings had been abandoned there. The consistency of these statements made them difficult for the defense to dismiss as mistaken identification. The prosecution prepared to present communications between David and others that suggested he had been discussing plans to handle a problem in the days before Celeste Rivas disappeared. While the messages were coded and didn't explicitly reference kidnapping or violence, prosecutors argued that the timing and context made their meaning clear. Defense attorneys objected that the communications were vague and could refer to innocent matters, but the prosecution maintained they demonstrated criminal intent. As the trial date approached, David's defense team faced the reality that their case had been fundamentally undermined by Celeste Morgan's testimony and the evidence that had emerged once the false alibi was exposed. Their strategy would need to shift from claiming innocence to creating reasonable doubt about specific elements of the prosecution's case, acknowledging that proving David hadn't been involved at all was no longer viable. When the entire defense strategy collapses because a key alibi witness reveals they were manipulated into lying, how does a defendant recover any credibility with a jury? The trial of David Chen for the kidnapping of Celeste Rivas began amid intense public interest and media coverage that transformed the courthouse into the center of a national conversation about trust, manipulation, and justice. The courtroom was packed daily with spectators, media representatives, and supporters of both Celeste Rivas's family and Celeste Morgan, who had become a sympathetic figure to many who saw her as another victim of David's deceptive schemes. Opening statements established the stark contrast between prosecution and defense narratives. The prosecution presented David as a calculating predator who had planned his crime carefully enough to establish an alibi witness months in advance, demonstrating sophisticated criminal thinking and consciousness of guilt. They promised to present overwhelming evidence that David had kidnapped Celeste Rivas and that his elaborate cover-up demonstrated awareness of his crimes and determination to evade justice. The defense's opening statement attempted to portray David as someone who had made poor choices in asking Celeste Morgan to provide cover for what he claimed was an affair he was trying to hide from family members. They argued that while lying about his whereabouts was wrong, it didn't mean he was guilty of kidnapping. The defense suggested that Celeste Morgan had been influenced by pressure from prosecutors and media attention to reinterpret innocent requests as sinister manipulation. Celeste Morgan's testimony was the emotional centerpiece of the prosecution's case. She spent 2 days on the stand detailing her relationship with David, how he had manipulated her into providing the false alibi, and the devastating realization that she had been used to cover for terrible crimes. Her testimony was compelling and sympathetic, with jurors visibly moved by her obvious remorse and the courage it had taken for her to come forward despite the personal costs. The cross-examination of Celeste Morgan was aggressive as defense attorneys attempted to discredit her testimony by highlighting inconsistencies between her original statements supporting the alibi and her current testimony. They suggested she had been pressured by prosecutors who offered immunity in exchange for changing her story to support their case against David. Wellington implied that her testimony was unreliable because it had changed significantly from what she originally told investigators. Prosecutors rehabilitated Celeste Morgan during redirect examination by having her explain in detail the psychological process she went through upon realizing she had been deceived. Expert testimony from psychologists supported her account, explaining that victims of manipulation often experience a period of denial and confusion before acknowledging the truth. The expert testimony helped jurors understand why someone in Celeste Morgan's position might initially maintain a false story before eventually coming forward with the truth. Physical evidence presented during the trial was substantial and damning. Forensic experts testified about DNA evidence linking Celeste Rivas to David's vehicle, fiber evidence connecting them, and digital evidence from his devices showing his research into kidnapping investigations and evidence avoidance. Each piece of evidence on its own might have been subject to alternative explanations, but collectively they created a powerful narrative of guilt that was difficult for the defense to counter. Cell phone records and surveillance footage placed David near locations relevant to the kidnapping at times that contradicted his alibi and demonstrated he had been untruthful about his movements. Technical experts explained how the phone data established his presence in specific areas and showed patterns of movement consistent with following or searching for someone. The defense's attempts to suggest the phone could have been somewhere while David was elsewhere were weakened by the volume and specificity of the location data. Witness testimony from people who had seen David near Celeste Rivas before her disappearance was more confident and detailed during trial testimony than it had been during the initial investigation. Several witnesses explained that they hadn't been certain of their identifications initially because they had been told David had an alibi, but once that alibi was revealed as false, they became more confident about what they had seen. Defense attorneys objected that this showed witnesses were being influenced by knowledge of the case rather than providing independent observations. The prosecution's case methodically demonstrated not just that David had kidnapped Celeste Rivas, but that he had planned the crime carefully, executed it with attention to avoiding evidence, and then manipulated an innocent person into providing cover that delayed his identification as a suspect. The pattern of behavior showed sophistication that made it clear this wasn't an impulsive act but rather a calculated crime by someone who understood investigations and deliberately took steps to evade detection. As the prosecution rested its case, legal analysts following the trial agreed that the evidence presented was strong and that David's defense faced significant challenges in creating reasonable doubt. The combination of Celeste Morgan's testimony about the false alibi, physical evidence linking David to Celeste Rivas, and digital evidence showing his preparation and planning created a comprehensive case that addressed potential defense arguments before they could gain traction. When a defendant's carefully constructed alibi is exposed as fraudulent and reveals premeditation of their crimes, how much harder does creating reasonable doubt become? The defense's case was brief and focused primarily on raising questions about the prosecution's evidence, rather than presenting an alternative narrative of what had happened to Celeste Rivas. Defense attorneys called experts who questioned the reliability of DNA transfer evidence and suggested that Celeste Rivas could have been in David's vehicle through innocent contact that neither of them remembered. The arguments were technical and focused on creating small doubts about specific pieces of evidence, rather than challenging the overall prosecution narrative. David chose not to testify in his own defense, a decision that disappointed many observers who hoped to hear his explanation for the false alibi and the evidence against him. His attorneys explained that the prosecution had failed to meet its burden of proof and that David wasn't required to prove his innocence. The decision not to testify was legally sound but left jurors without hearing David's version of events, potentially reinforcing the impression that he had no good explanation for the evidence presented. Closing arguments presented the starkest contrast between prosecution and defense perspectives. The prosecution emphasized the totality of evidence demonstrating David's guilt, focusing particularly on the premeditated creation of a false alibi as proof of guilty consciousness. They argued that innocent people don't spend months manipulating friends into providing cover stories for time periods when they plan to do nothing wrong. The false alibi alone, they argued, demonstrated David knew he would need to deceive investigators because he was planning criminal activity. The defense's closing argument urged jurors to carefully examine each piece of evidence individually and to recognize that the prosecution's case relied on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of a witness who had admittedly lied to investigators. They argued that while David had made poor decisions about his alibi, poor judgment didn't equal guilt of kidnapping. The argument seemed to acknowledge implicitly that David had been deceptive while trying to separate that deception from the kidnapping charges. Jury deliberations lasted 3 days, suggesting jurors were taking their responsibilities seriously and examining evidence carefully. The length of deliberations created anxiety for both the prosecution and Celeste Rivas's family, as extended deliberations sometimes indicated disagreement among jurors about guilt. Legal analysts debated what the prolonged discussions might mean for the verdict. The guilty verdict on all charges was announced in a courtroom, so tense that the silence was absolute as the jury foreperson read each count. David showed little visible reaction as guilty verdicts were read for kidnapping, assault, and obstruction of justice charges. Celeste Rivas's family members broke down in tears, embracing each other and the prosecutors who had fought for justice. Celeste Morgan, attending the verdict announcement, also wept, her tears a mixture of relief that justice was served and continued guilt over her unwitting role in initially providing David with cover. Sentencing brought victim impact statements that provided some of the trial's most emotional moments. Celeste Rivas's mother spoke about the nightmare of not knowing where her daughter was or what had happened to her, and about the agony of knowing someone who could have helped find her had been delayed in their investigation by David's lies. She addressed David directly, demanding to know where her daughter was and what he had done, but he remained silent, offering no information or remorse. Celeste Morgan provided her own statement during sentencing, addressing both the court and Celeste Rivas's family. She expressed profound remorse for her role in delaying the investigation, even though she had been manipulated, and pledged to dedicate herself to raising awareness about how perpetrators use manipulation to involve innocent people in their crimes. Her statement was powerful and added to the overall portrait of David as someone whose crimes had victimized multiple people in different ways. The judge's sentence was severe, reflecting the seriousness of the crimes and David's complete lack of remorse or cooperation in revealing what had happened to Celeste Rivas. Multiple life sentences were imposed consecutively, ensuring David would never be free. The judge's statement accompanying the sentence noted that the premeditated creation of a false alibi demonstrated sophisticated criminal planning that warranted the maximum penalties available. The judge expressed hope that David might eventually choose to provide information about Celeste Rivas's location to give her family the closure they desperately needed. David was transferred to maximum security prison to begin serving his sentences, leaving behind questions that would haunt everyone involved. His refusal to provide information about what he had done with Celeste Rivas, or where she might be found, meant her family's suffering continued even after his conviction. The case remained open in that sense, with investigators still searching for answers about Celeste Rivas's fate, and hoping David might eventually choose to end their uncertainty. The case's resolution brought various forms of justice and closure, but left many wounds unhealed. Celeste Morgan continued therapy to process the trauma of having been manipulated and used, working through guilt that therapy helped her understand was misplaced, but that felt no less real. Celeste Rivas's family found some measure of justice in David's conviction but continued to search for their daughter and hope for answers about what had happened to her. The case became a cautionary tale about manipulation, the vulnerability of trust, and the ways perpetrators involve innocent people in their crimes without those individuals understanding what they're participating in. When someone's manipulation of trust leads to terrible consequences for multiple victims, and when that person refuses to provide closure even after conviction, what does justice really mean for the families left searching for answers?